requires commitment from all stakeholders working together. WHO promotes the participation of all relevant sectors to contribute to the improvement of capacities of those state parties to prevent, detect, and respond to public health emergencies of international concern, but also to accelerate the implementation of IHR. Successful implementation of IHR core capacities is dependent on that commitment by all sectors to work together to accelerate that progress that we just noted in key capacity areas. But keeping in mind the challenges that countries sometimes face in terms of sufficient implementation of IHR, there are many tools and methods that countries can use to review and evaluate where additional law and regulation in country could potentially help accelerate this further compliance. Note that at the end of the presentation, my colleague Catherine will provide a few more details on how these international tools and norms, such as the JEE and IHR, among other sources, can be used to help provide a baseline from which countries can improve upon their methods, such as legal mapping, which I know Dr. Tosa will talk about in just a few brief moments, and can assist countries with the review of their current legal landscape and provide those data-driven inputs that can help catalyze that support for action from policymakers across sectors and across levels. Just briefly, one tool in particular that can help assist countries with establishing a baseline is the joint external evaluation. Based on recognition of the challenges identified during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, the JEE was developed based on recommendations by the Review Committee of the role of IHR in the Ebola outbreak response. It was recognized that more transparency and accountability would be beneficial moving forward. So this caused that shift from what we saw as exclusively self-evaluations to also using external evaluations to identify urgent needs and provide data for direct, to direct efforts and where resources should be directed most appropriately. And then subsequent evaluations are used to measure progress. So specifically, when we look at national legislation, policy, and financing, it calls for countries to have an adequate framework to enable and support implementation of their obligations and rights to comply with IHR. However, it's really important to keep in mind that there are legal elements throughout all capacity areas included in the JEE, including emergency preparedness, emergency response operations, among others. So then just to briefly narrow our scope just a little bit even further as we lead into Dr. Tosa's presentation, recognizing the challenges that countries sometimes face in terms of sufficient implementation of IHR, what are ways in which the law is used at the country level to help accelerate further compliance with IHR? A country's legal framework for emergency management and operations is a document or series of documents agreed to by the national, district, or local government that can formally establish emergency management and coordination activities at the country level. So here we're specifically referring to a country's legislative framework. So through development of legal instruments in country that clearly define how these coordination mechanisms will fit and operate within a government structure, it's an important step doing so in order to achieve emergency preparedness goals. Through a country's legislative framework, a country can agree to formally establish and authorize multi-sectoral collaboration and provide support where needed to mobilize necessary resources. For example, coordination of nationwide resources can include designation of the IHR national focal point to communicate with IHR contacts and relevant multi-sectoral stakeholders in countries. So what are some additional examples of emergency management and multi-sectoral coordination in a country's legislative framework? The first example that I've listed here are emergency declarations. Emergency declarations are often used to serve two main purposes. One is an announcement made by authorized government officials. They're a powerful communication tool and an opportunity to tell others that tell the public that an emergency has occurred. Emergency declarations also often trigger emergency powers, so that range of allowable functions to expedite use of emergency funds. A second example is declaration of a public health emergency. So many countries also have separate authority activated by the declaration of a public health emergency. The declaration may be a health-related disaster declaration or a separate public health emergency declaration. These public health declarations may differ from disaster declarations in that they specifically may be delegated to health officers and may trigger those specific public health powers. Because public health declarations may differ, it's vital that sectors work together to establish the scope of their roles and their responsibilities and coordination with one another. Another example we've listed on the screen here is enabling authority for public health emergency operations centers. And I know Dr. Tosa is going to give us an example of that in just a few minutes here. So this is enabling authority for PHEOCs provided by legislation or government directive that can be utilized to provide an entity, so the public health department, a ministry, an agency, et cetera, the requisite authority to manage those public health emergencies, and is often an essential component of the National Emergency Management Framework. And the last example I've included here on the screen just brings us down a little bit further, which is we're not just thinking about the broad enabling authorities that declare emergencies or establish structures. We're also thinking about the specific public health powers that are used by local, regional, or national governments, and how these powers are used, and who has the power to use them. Is it the president, parliament, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Defense, etc.? It's crucial that as we think about legal preparedness, we consider how all of these various entities work together and how they're authorized to collaborate and coordinate during an emergency. And that includes what powers do they have, but also those really important, what are the limitations on these powers? So in summary, a few elements that I've left up here just for consideration as we go through is, what are some elements to consider when developing effective emergency management laws? It could be elements such as clarity versus flexibility. So how do we ensure that our laws are clear enough, yet also flexible enough to allow for changes and changes based on, new or emerging threats? Adequate funding mechanisms, establishing emergency funding sources, or authorizing fully funded permanent programs, for example. Also the enabling, multi-sectoral coordination and expressly authorizing data flow across levels. These are just a few examples. So to take these concepts a bit further, I would now like to turn it over to Dr. Tosa, who will take us through a country example. So the experience of Togo with the development of enabling authorities to establish their PHEOC and how they have considered along the way, the role of law and its impact in directing emergency management and emergency operations. So I will now stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Tosa, for your presentation. So thank you. Go ahead and share your screen as you need.
Can you shut your presentation?
I think I just did, so you should be able to share now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Emily, for giving me the floor. My slides are in English, but I would like to present in French. Ok, donc bonjour à tous. Merci beaucoup, Émilie. Merci aux organisateurs de me donner l'opportunité de partager l'expérience du Togo en matière de mise en place du cadre légal pour la création.
In setting up the legal framework in the creation of EOCs and their running, their management. My presentation will be based on 4 major areas after a brief presentation: the mapping of laws in terms of health security in Togo, and then we're going to see the process that has been set up, that has been followed in order to set up this legislative framework for the establishment of EOCs. And then thirdly, we're going to see what were the benefits that have been drawn from this legal framework, and then lessons learned, and then a conclusion. So by way of introduction, I would say that following the Ebola epidemic in West Africa and in the world in 2013, many decisions were taken at the international level, including the establishment of EOC, to strengthen the system. Togo actually joined these measures, but very early, Togo had to face many challenges, which are the lack of resources, especially the absence of sufficient and quality human resources. We should also bear in mind that the health system is very weak, and then we also have difficulties in achieving the international standards. And it should also be underscored that thanks to the setting up of the EOC, there was a risk of competing functions, a risk of conflict between the health EOC and the formal structures that had been established long before and that were participating in the surveillance and the management of emergency situations. In this situation, the setting up of the EOC was actually the outcome of a consensus process at the level of the Ministry of Health. So that's before the setting up of the public health EOC, and within the framework of international health laws, there were many legislations that had to do with environment, public health, transports, and borders, including the issues of isolation, quarantine, issues that had to do with transport, vehicle inspections, planes, and ships. So there have always been laws, legislations on food security, laws on agriculture, and especially animal health, laws regarding radiation, chemical product, and the transportation of dangerous products, the law relating to the use and dissemination of health information, especially with the issues of confidentiality and protection. These are just few examples. We also had laws that had to do with the activities and of other competent structures at the level of states and the local level. So this legislation has been existing. So the law setting up the EOC was a ministerial decision that was signed in 2017 on the 15th of September 2017. It is this law that actually set up the Public Health Emergency Operations Center in Togo So this draft law actually define the attributes, the responsibilities of this center, that is the coordination of the different actors that are involved in these activities, the way these activities are to be overseen on the field, and then the way this center will be liaising with the Ministry of Health, which is the umbrella authority. This law also defines measures that should be taken during an epidemic or a public health emergency, and the way information should be communicated in real time in due course by a group of experts. It is some of these components of this law that was setting up these centers, and 2 years later, we had a serious another decision that actually was defining the way this center was going to be run and its operations. And this was to be sustained by other structures that are to be involved in the management of public health emergencies. These were partners, National Civil Protection Agency, which is in charge of managing disasters at the national level. We also had a key element in this decision. This decision actually defines the criteria through which this center can be activated. These criteria are twofold. Either there is actually a serious event that is affecting public health, or a serious threat that has a national or international character. The other criteria has to do with the specific event that will require the mobilization of huge resources that will lead to the actually to bring together the contribution of many entities and partners of state structures. So these are the two criteria. This second challenge that actually occurred some few years enabled the center to work together with other emergency actors, and this actually made it possible to define the role of all the stakeholders, and also brought about an important element in the way conflicts could be managed, or the way competition could be managed. And this was important to help the center to work in an integrated manner with other entities. Now, let me tell you the way we actually proceeded to adopt this decision, these roles. First of all, we received a major support from CDC Atlanta, thanks to Emily, who really seriously assisted us. And thanks to this support, we actually did the mapping of existing laws, and the mapping I just presented a while ago. And then we carried out the analysis of these laws. So we had to define the frameworks. So one of these frameworks was the framework to set up the EOC. The second aspect is that this work was done by a multidisciplinary team made up of epidemiologists, the managers of public health emergency centers, the authorities of the Ministry of Health, and of course, the legal officers of the department, the legal department of the Ministry of Health. So practically speaking, a first stage of the work of this team was to actually prepare or actually collect documents. Many technical documents were necessary, especially TORs, policies, plans, procedures, SOPs, and other technical documents that have to do with the management of EOCB at the national or international level. And this activity required the organization of many workshops, bringing together the members of this multidisciplinary team in order to achieve results and set up the foundation for the preparation of legal documents. The next stage was the preparation of the legal document by the legal officers on the gratis, the epidemiologists, the managers, the authorities, and of course, this in line with their competence, because this was a participatory process. The last process was the validation of the document by the authorities and the entire public health sector. And I would like to underscore at this level that the involvement of legal officers was very essential, because they are the ones that had to guarantee the quality of the work that had been done in terms of mapping of acceptability and in terms of legal strength. So their contribution was essential, and this is what prompted the authority to adopt the work that was done. But I should admit that we needed about a whole year to do this work, because we needed a consensus throughout the health sector, given the problems that were faced. And of course, we also had to face some reluctance. But what I should underscore is that we actually decided to involve the Ministry of Health in the validation of this document, because we had to go right up to the Prime Minister's office or the presidency. This will require a lot of time, because the process would have been very long. So in order to avoid the difficulties and the health risks, we just had to limit the validation of this document to the level of the Ministry of Health. So what were the benefits? The network very poor. So we actually budget line from the state. So we have an annual budget from the state today. We have a building. Presently, I'm talking to you from my office. My colleagues are in their offices. We are having an operation room. It's just a very provisional center. We are also having a vehicle to move to the field. We have received other equipment, and we have received resources from other partners, the GIZ, the German Corporation, the World Bank, the American Ministry of Defense, JICA, in order to receive the resources that will enable us to build the final building and also receive equipment. The second law actually enabled us to strengthen the implementation of SOPs and define the attributions or the missions of all the other stakeholders. The law came in to define the technical attributions and also help to facilitate the collaboration and coordination with other entities. This is the case with the National Civil Protection Center and the National Agency for the Management of Disasters. So this law actually clearly defines the roles and responsibilities of each entity. So it clearly defines when the Ministry of Health can actually move to pass over the baton to the Center for the Management of Disasters. Now, what are the lessons learned in this process? They understood that in the second decision, we already designed the way the immune center was going to be run. We already defined the terms of reference of the emergency center that had already been validated and authorized. So thanks to this document that was already subjected to a large consensus, the legal officer just had to draw some inspiration from this document in order to prepare a law. So the work was very easy. So the more we knew where we were moving to, the more the lawyers were free to help us to design the law. So the work of the entire team was also a lesson that we had to draw, because when we set up a good working, a good team spirit with the team of lawyers, the second document was easily prepared, even though the minister took time to reflect on the issue to be sure that all the stakeholders were in agreement. In conclusion, I should say that it is true that law ensures authority and enables us to have access to the required resources for more effectiveness and to be respected. But I think that this document, this draft law, this legal framework requires a very huge communication in order to ensure the involvement of all the stakeholders so as to ensure its implementation. So we need to carry out a large communication activity around this document. So we have also understood that appropriate anchorage is very important for the smooth running of the center, because if you are far at the summit, at the of the ladder, or if your document was signed by the President of the Republic, the political commitment is stronger and reaction will be much better, because you will not need 4 authorities to sign a mission order, for instance. So I think that this anchorage must be studied from the word go, so that if there's a problem, we can actually handle it together. Because once the center is straight, it's important. The anchorage can evolve, because these documents should be assessed. And finally, I should also confess that even if we have a legal framework or political or technical documents, I think that what matters is the resources. We need resources to set up an EOC, which is worthy of the name, and be endowed with equipment and infrastructure for you to have visibility and for people to consider you and to enable efficiency in your action. So these are some of the few elements I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Great, thank you, Dr. Tosa. And I think we'll hand it over to Catherine to briefly take us through the rest of the presentation, and we will open it up for some discussion. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to reserve what I hope is plenty of time for discussions, because I know there are a lot of questions, but I do want to give you now some summaries of the things we've talked about and language you can use when discussing the types of things that Ms. Rosenfeld and Dr. Tosa have brought us through, the role of law in multisectoral coordination, and how we can use law to inform, and the study of law to inform our policy discussions. So we're going to start with defining this idea of legal epidemiology. This is the practice of studying law to inform policy discussions. It is the scientific study of law as a factor in the cause, distribution, and prevention of disease and injury in a population. You have heard from Dr. Tosa now the connection between legal mapping and the lawmaking process. Legal mapping is one type of legal epidemiology. It helps us understand what the law says. Another type is legal evaluation, which helps us understand what the law does, how it supports public health activity. In Ms. Rosenfeld's discussion, we thought through the fact that there are many different legal systems, and they vary depending on the legal system you are in. But in public health law and in studying laws for public health, we use these 8 issues that are common in almost all legal systems to discuss those issues we really want to focus on how law supports public health. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the main ones. I want to draw your attention to just a few because they directly impact multisectoral coordination in emergency response. So first, the authority to act. We've heard from Dr. Tosa that it's really critical to have the authority clearly stated in a legal instrument if you are enabling entities to respond, especially in a situation where you might have multiple agencies responsible for different parts of coordination. Identifying clearly who has the authority to respond is critical to multisectoral coordination. In the same manner, duty, who has a responsibility, not just who can, but who should or who must, and that can be defined in legal instruments. Finally, I'll draw your attention to the sustainability issue. Sustainability may be supported by laws that require dedicated budgets and funding to ensure participants who are collaborating together are clearly understand have a clear budget. These are are some of the types of issues that come up across legal systems, regardless of which legal system you are practicing in. I want to now give you just some visuals to help with the concepts of legal mapping and legal evaluation. As Dr. Tosa said, legal mapping can be done in a specific country or jurisdiction, but you also might want to compare compare different countries to inform your policy discussions. So I'll show you one larger example of legal mapping, but legal evaluation is, of course, a longer term process. Here's one example of a legal mapping study, asking what laws say across countries or jurisdictions on a topic. This particular mapping was performed to understand which of these 18 countries that you see outlined had laws that addressed public health reporting. And this mapping was performed as part of an effort to determine how laws were supporting implementation of the international health regulations. I want to also briefly touch on a second tool that is available for strengthening multi-sectoral coordination, and that is legal framework guides. Legal framework guides are essentially what you can turn to when you are doing legal mapping and you want to know what the field, legal epidemiologists, other public health lawyers, and experts in the field have to say about how they know, or we know from studying the law, how law can support public health activities, specifically how law can encourage public health emergency operations centers to be established and support multi-sectoral coordination. Legal framework guides, I'll just briefly discuss the components. They use, of course, our knowledge of legal systems, like Ms. Rosenfeld has discussed, knowledge that we've gained from other legal epidemiology studies, and then specific subject matter specifications and mechanisms from experts and techniques in this field. This legal framework guide is a reference list. It can be used to walk through the laws in a country or in the state you're studying, in a jurisdiction, and more fully understand what legal authorities are present. Just to give you some buzzwords, the main subjects are domains, and then the details about how law supports those main subjects are called attributes. This is a picture of a legal framework that you might use, a legal framework guide you might use to review legal authorities in one country or between many. As you can see, it looks very much like a list. The domain and main subject is at the top. And this one specifically dealing with the legal instrument establishing a public health emergency operations center. Details for those, the characteristics of law that establish the emergency operations center are then listed below. And you use this guide to walk through the law and say, does a legal instrument establish a national public health emergency operations center? If so, does it establish coordination? And you can use these components to ask things like, does the legal instrument describe core functions of the public health emergency operations center? Does it establish a leadership structure? Does it require multi-sectoral coordination from the following sectors? There are many sources for legal framework guides, just so you know all the components that go into them. Global norms, of course, are a large one, the international health regulations. What's known in literature, what we already know from studies, what we know in technical guidance might help with the specific attributes or those descriptions of what the law might contain. And then observed practices. What do other laws already say? And finally, stakeholder meetings. What do people want to see in the law, or where do we need to determine what the law is saying? I'll spend a little bit more time just on this slide, simply because it's a process and sums up, I think, what Ms. Rosenfeld and Dr. Tosa have already given you practical examples of, so you can imagine it happening in your work and in your area. The first thing that you want to do when you're conducting a mapping exercise to see how law is supporting your public health activity is to establish a baseline. What categories of law or characteristics of law are being reviewed? What laws are in place for emergency management across relevant sectors? The next thing you want to do is actually map out the law. What does the legal instrument say? Remember that the legal mapping is a part of that larger study of law to determine what legal instruments say. What domains and attributes, if you're using a legal framework guide, what domains and attributes are covered by the legal instrument? And then once you've done that mapping, as Dr. Tosa described, stakeholders and policymakers and analysts can get together and determine what areas of strength have been identified, what areas of strength in the legal instrument are supporting that multi-sectoral coordination. And then what gaps might be present that could further become strengths? How could legal instruments further support multi-sectoral coordination? For everyone's information, there is a legal framework guide for Public Health Emergency Operations Center in the works. It is currently under review. It began with stakeholder engagement with a technical workshop held in collaboration with the WHO, Afro, Africa CDC, and the US CDC. You may notice in the picture, many of the panelists that you see weekly, the speakers and the other participants in these webinars. So the policy analysts reviewed and finalized technical guides, including the development of this legal framework guide. And the guide is currently under review and will be distributed to WHO Afro member states, and is also useful in discussion for other countries. If you want an example of a legal framework guide that is already in publication and that has some background information as well that can further inform any of your thoughts and ideas and discussions, the Legal Framework Guide for the National Public Health Institutes is available online at this link, and you will have these slides in Discord as well. That's all from me. I want to be able to spend a sufficient time with any questions, so I will turn it back over to you, Martin. Thank you. And Martin, I think you're muted.
That happens a lot. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, Emily, and Dr. Tosa for your presentation. I also want to mention here we have a panelist, Ramesh, with us, who has been helping in the background, Wami, Silas, and Osman. So we don't have much time. I think we have about 12 minutes. So we'll dive right into the questions. I've seen several questions. Some are in the Q&A, some are in the discussion. So I managed to get, but I also thank the panelists who have helped to answer some of the questions in the chat. But for the sake of our participants who do not speak English or who want other languages, I'll just go over those questions and request the panelists to quickly go over those questions so that everybody benefits. So at the beginning of Emily's presentation, there was a question on the meaning of a socialist. We are talking about the different types of laws. So what was a socialist about? And then there's also a question related to how does one understand a drastically different legal system from one's own system? And rather, how may one understand a drastically different legal system to one's own system? I guess this is about different legal system in different setups. And then again to Emily, what is the meaning of mixed law? And I think this is finally to Emily again. How does the legal process restructure multi-sectoral coordination in emergency preparedness? So I will stop there and then I'll pick up another set of questions. Over to you.
Great. So I think, fortunately, our panelists were able to answer those questions directly. I think most of the questions that you've just summarized involved the role of legal systems and resources, just specifically talking about the different types of laws. I will have Catherine post a link to some other online resources about the types of legal systems. So if you'd like to read more about it, We can also provide additional resources in Discord, but Catherine or myself will post a link to our Library of Congress here in the US, which can give you some more information specifically regarding the study of law and all the different legal systems that we have talked about during the presentation. It may give some additional clarity there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. I think I talked about those aspects, and I communicated about the how can I say, the scope of our law. I thought that the scope of our law was limited to the Ministry of Health. We didn't involve for the first law, the creating the EOC, we didn't involve the parliamentary or the public. We wanted to go quickly because we needed the structure. Now we have to go up and increase the scope of this law. And I think will be the next step we have to face. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tosa. One thing that is going is interesting, and I think as we get into the COVID vaccine, and I've seen a few questions on that, is this will be very interesting moving forward. What is the key role of law in the vaccination process? And I think here the question is to our lawyers and the presenters. Could there be forced vaccination? Who gets prioritized and why? Who doesn't get prioritized, and what are the risks that they continue to pose to the rest of the community, etc. So, Kathleen and Emily, you are both lawyers, so please share in the response. Over to you, Emily, first.
Sure. Go ahead, Emily.
Oh, sure. Okay. And please feel free to fill in if so I think when we're talking about, mandatory vaccination or how laws will be utilized as a tool for, COVID vaccination, I think back to the presentation when we're looking at, the country-specific context, and each country will be looking at determining what is the scope of those powers and how is that, completed from a country-specific decision. But I will, also remind participants that, vaccination or vaccination laws in particular are those, public health powers, or they may be one of those public health powers that we discussed during the presentation. And these are the specific public health powers that are used by those local, regional, or national governments. But it is important to determine who has those powers, do they have those powers, and how are they utilized? So, as it relates to specific countries, that determination will be made by member states. But it is important to think about these concepts, especially if there maybe aren't, these powers in place now, and what that's going to look like. So it's a really important question, and one that I think really highlights how law and these sort of public health powers help shape some of our actions as emergency management specialists and other professionals. Catherine, anything to add on that?
Sure, I'll jump in quickly just to say I concur that I think this is going to be a country by country determination, especially when you're dealing with an emergency use authorization with vaccinations. Many of you are probably familiar with some other vaccination requirements that are tied to employment or school. And there are different ways in which the law may impact vaccine distribution. I think it's unclear and still to be determined how that's going to happen for each individual country with the current vaccines are under development. But what I can say is I think regardless of the mandatory nature or not of vaccinations, you will see the law coming into play with multi-sectoral collaboration. Who is required to act, who has the authority to transport, to distribute, to hold vaccinations, to provide vaccinations. All of those issues may be spelled out in not only laws, but then, of course, some of the operating procedures and guidelines that follow. So you may see more law playing more of a role in the coordination of distribution than in.
So thank you for answering those questions. Unfortunately, we cannot answer all the questions. And again, we remind our participants to engage at the Discord platform to continue this very interesting discussion. Just two things related to that. There was one question on whether there is IHR will be reviewed in the future. Yes, IHR regulations are being reviewed now as we speak, so that's an ongoing situation. Actually, review of its functioning in the COVID response. There's also another question related to issues of equity and equality in terms of vaccine access to on the African continent. I can add that Africa CDC is leading on access to vaccine, and from perceptions to distribution, all those issues are being addressed. And if you follow the CDC website, you'll get information on that. So we have 1 minute left. I'll use this 1 minute to first to mention two things. One is next week, we will continue with this series of multi-sectoral coordination. Specifically, it will be on cluster coordination for public health emergencies. That will be the topic. And also, I believe, a country presentation as well. At this point, may I also mention that this webinar series, as those of you who have participated, they are really useful, educative, and we think we all continue to learn. So for that reason, you can get a certificate of participation to show you have these are kind of seminars you get at master's class, really, master's of epidemiology class, etc. So there is certificate, which is good news for everybody. The third point is we cannot, we cannot emphasize enough the importance of your feedback to participants. We really value your feedback, and this helps us to improve week in, week out as we progress with this webinar series. And at this point, I sincerely thank Catherine, Emily, Dr. Tosa for your presentations. Very well done. And also, before we close, we thank those behind the scenes during the week that enabled the happening of today's seminar. So thank you, everybody. And with that, depending on where you are, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and looking forward to see you next week. Ciao, ciao. Bye.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.